Our last section in this chapter are our advances in genetics. So how is everything we've learned about genetics kind of helping pave the way for the future of humankind and all that? First thing we want to look at is selective breeding, which is actually broken into two techniques, which is inbreeding and hybridization. Due to the fact that we know how traits are passed on, why don't we control how traits are passed on? That'd be awesome. In fact, we do it, and a lot of times this was actually started unintentionally. But it's the process of selecting organisms with desired traits to be parents of the next generation. And it's called selective breeding. Um, you can think of it as the same way you think of attraction. I mean, if you're attracted to certain traits, then those traits are going to be more likely to be passed on because that's who you're going to mate with, and therefore you're going to reproduce offspring with the chance to get those traits. Corn is a great example of this that we have today. The corn that we eat has a lot of different uses. However, there are corns out there that you can't even eat. And the way we can eat corn is because we've selectively bred the traits that we like to eat in corn, and that's why we have corn today. Um, our first type of selective breeding is inbreeding. Inbreeding involves crossing two individuals that have similar characteristics. So basically, if I have two fat turkeys and I want offspring that are fat, then I might as well breed them together and get fat turkeys. I like fat turkeys because they provide more food for me, as opposed to getting two skinny turkeys hoping to get a fat turkey out of them. Doesn't really work too well. But it just increases the chances that genetic disorder or a mutation is passed on. In the case of turkeys, being fat is something I want. Here, our turkeys are actually, it's the coloration of them. So if this is like a show turkey or something and you want a show turkey, do it. Also, horse racing does this a lot. They inbreed their horses. So if we have a really fast horse, I want to breed it with another fast horse in the hope that the offspring will be even faster than its parents. Hybridization is actually the cross of two genetically different individuals. And this is how we get most of our apples, actually. We want to take these big juicy apples with the sweet apples. So I breed a juicy apple with a sweet apple, and I get a big and juicy apple. We've been doing it for years. Technically, you can call these GMOs, which are genetically modified organisms, because of this process. So there's a lot of stigma out there about GMOs being bad. Well, you do your research, GMOs aren't really that bad for you. It just depends on how it's being bred. Some things might not necessarily be what you want to be putting in your body if you're eating it. Another way of doing it is cloning. Cloning, again, there are ethical reasons on why we don't do it in humans, but some organisms do this naturally. We've already talked about how budding and asexual reproduction is kind of a form of cloning. But humans can do this as well. A couple plants are King's Holly and African Violet. Basically, you can just cut a piece off and plant it in the ground, and it'll grow a new organism just from that, so that's pretty cool. Cloning, you are going to have the same genes as the parent organism is. Next, we do have genetic engineering, which is transferring genes from one organism into the DNA of another organism. This was what they talked about in Jurassic Park when they redid their dinosaurs and they were missing gaps in their DNA. They took it from frogs. That was genetic engineering. A lot of times we do this to get insulin. We actually genetically engineer it. Again, we take the DNA of your pancreas that produces insulin, we inject it into bacteria, and we make bacteria make insulin for us. So that's a form of genetic engineering. Other uses, humans' genes can be inserted into cows, and therefore cows can produce protein coded in human DNA through their milk, which can help produce blood clotting proteins for hemophilia, which is kind of an interesting thing to go about doing, which helps that genetic disorder, but that's also going to be done through genetic engineering of this cow's protein and milk. Genetic engineering crops. We can genetically engineer crops to survive harsher conditions such as weather, insects, or poor soil conditions, which again, all pretty beneficial. And then we also go into gene therapy, which we touched on a little bit before, and this is correcting genetic disorders in humans by replacing alleles that cause these genetic disorders. We're still working on this because there's a lot of blocks when it comes to ethics. Is this an ethical thing to do? And I did ask you to write your opinions on that from the last video. Concerns about genetic gene therapy is that if it's safe or not. This is a fairly recent um, science in that sense, so there are still worries about long-term effects in humans and the environment on actually genetic engineering things. We also have the ethical question, obviously. Where do we draw the line on? Are we playing God and going against nature and all that? Also, we use this to learn about our own genetics. We have the Human Genome Project, which is currently going on, looking through human DNA and deciding what traits are determined by which genes and which alleles throughout all of our DNA. You can think of how long our DNA molecules are. That's pretty much the human genome is just mapping out that. We also have DNA fingerprinting, which is identifying certain genes for what traits they cause. The Human Genome Project, again, the genome is all the DNA in one cell of an organism, so the Human Genome Project would be about all the DNA in one human cell. The goal of the project is to identify the DNA sequences of every human, or of every gene in the human genome. So basically we're going to DNA fingerprint each of our genes and figure out what each of them do, what each gene controls, and what different traits are available and different alleles used to control those traits. So that's a huge ongoing project, and it's actually very interesting to follow and think about if you ever get into researching that. DNA fingerprinting, we're going to use this genome project and we're going to identify relationships between them. We're going to be able to see who your relatives are. It's a very common thing these days. In fact, you can order DNA kits these days and see what your ancestry is all about through DNA fingerprinting. But they're going to identify those genes that control traits, and we're going to see, okay, your gene here matches your mom's and these other two people, so you're probably related to these other two people in some way. It's also a way of identifying who you are, because no two people in the world is going to have the exact same DNA. And this includes identical twins. Their DNA isn't going to be exactly the same. It is fairly close, though.